really enjoyed my time in government. It was a great place to throw ideas out there, convene and connect, organize, provide guidance and advice on some of the most pressing challenges in the world with access to people who could actually make a difference. But one of my frustrations and challenges that I continue to run up against in government is while you can convene and connect, while you can generate ideas, while you can advise around these challenges, it's really difficult to build around them. And the more in government I saw us trying to get creative and trying to get stuff done, the more I realized we were increasingly turning to the private sector. It seemed every time we had a big idea, we were going to the private sector asking if they could help, asking if they could build things, asking if there's a way that they could bring their expertise and capabilities to some of these pressing challenges. And so when I was presented with an opportunity to leave the State Department and build out a new entity at Google called Google Ideas, I jumped at the opportunity. I figured why not try to actually build something that was looking at these challenges from inside of one of the private sector companies that I had routinely engaged with during my time at the State Department. And Google Ideas was initially framed very vaguely as a think/do tank that was going to think about and act on global challenges in new and innovative ways, very broad with an open mandate. And it's based on this assumption that technology is part of every problem and part of every solution. And so if you think about any challenge in the world, whether there's an obvious or not obvious link to technology, there certainly is a role for these tools of the 21st century to play. And so we're organized by focus areas. And the focus areas are determined by challenges that, where there's not an obvious link to philanthropy, where the linkage to a technology company is less obvious and less natural, but they're still hugely pressing challenges. So when I thought about what's the first focus area that I really want to dive into, what's the first focus area that I think would be shocking to people for a company like Google to get involved with, but still critically important, I chose radicalization. Now, radicalization as a topic wasn't random for me. It's something that I've looked at for about 7+ years, 8+ years, and it's something that I'm deeply passionate about. And it's something that I felt like in government we were so limited in terms of what we could actually do around it. We were limited in who we could meet with. We were limited in who we could engage with. There were a lot of actors in the Middle East and South Asia and elsewhere that were very hesitant about engaging with the US government. Now, in addition to the personal passion, radicalization is probably one of the most, if not the most important unanswered challenge that we face today. It's the challenge that makes everything else in the world that much more dangerous. 52% of the world is under the age of 30. In Muslim communities around the world, 61% of the population is under the age of 30. The vast majority of those are at risk, either socially or economically or both. And a substantial portion of those at-risk young people seem to think that the best alternative that they have in life is to throw themselves at the feet of whatever violent extremist organization is closest to them, either in terms of identity or proximity. Now, before I actually tell you what this idea that we're going to pursue with Google Ideas is around radicalization, let me actually walk you through the whole process of this idea coming to fruition, because I want you to have the same kind of experience of different anecdotes and different interactions clashing together, ultimately leading to what we're going to be doing in June. And before I show you this next slide, I want to give you what I think is some useful background, which is I'm Jewish from Connecticut. I took this photo in 2005. Between 2004 and 2006, I spent a great deal of time living in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all different parts of the world, interviewing initially youth, but what ultimately transformed into a greater interest in interviewing militants. Militants with Hezbollah, militants with Al-Qaeda, and militants with a group called Asbad al-Ansar, which is linked to Al-Qaeda. I took this photo in southern Lebanon, in a camp called Ain Helway, which is a hotbed for Al-Qaeda in Lebanon, as well as militants from Hezbollah and other organizations. And I had all kinds of perceptions about what I would find there. But one thing happened in this camp, and then I'll tell you another story from my second interactions with militants in a different camp that got me to think about radicalization initially in a different way. Everything starts with a misperception, and then every idea germinates from that misperception being shattered. And what I knew about radicalization was what I'd read in books, what I'd seen on TV, what I'd read about in the papers, what the media had fed me. And I remember doing a lot of these interviews with these at-risk young people, and in particular some of these militants, and asking them why they joined. And they'd give me some religious or ideological reason. They'd give me some explanation that had something to do with Israel or the United States. And this was pretty much universal across the board. And I never thought to ask the right follow-up questions after that until two things happened. One, after doing an interview with one of the leaders of these militant organizations, a group of youth took me into one of these back rooms where they keep all their weapons. Floor to ceiling, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, suicide bomber vests, AK-47s, every kind of weapon that you could possibly imagine. It was a pretty terrifying experience, as you could imagine, given that I'd been blindfolded and taken into this place, and so it's not like I knew where I was or anybody I knew actually was aware of my location. And they insisted on putting this vest on me, putting all these sort of weapons in the pockets, putting these guns in my hand, and then snapping photos at me. And I wasn't quite clear on what was going on, but it was a pretty uncomfortable scenario. Then one of them, after he snaps a few photos of me, reaches into one of these cabinets, pulls out what looked like a remote control, and holds it up like this. Then they're snapping more photos. And it suddenly occurred to me that there's wires coming out of the vest, and this is not a situation that I at all anticipated myself being in. I have no idea if what followed was 1 minute, 30 seconds, 5 seconds, or 5 minutes, but it basically occurred to me that these people may not have very positive intentions about what's actually to follow. And then they just burst out laughing. They were playing a practical joke on me and actually holding something that wasn't a remote control, but just some sort of weird kind of plastic device. And it was very, very strange to have this happen. I sort of talked to them about it afterwards, and they really thought there was nothing wrong with doing this. They actually thought they were trying to be funny. And it was this weird, weird moment where these people that I was terrified of, these violent extremists, had sort of stepped out of their militant identity and were wearing their youth hat. And it was the first glimpse that I got into the fact that every single violent extremist, in addition to wearing their extremism hat, at the end of the day, they're a young person. And they dance in and out of different identities. And I'm absolutely not apologizing or excusing their behavior. I absolutely think these organizations are despicable. These are violent extremist organizations. But I was there doing research. And given that I was there doing research, I was fascinated to see if I could find out who the youth were behind all these masks of violent extremism. And so a second incident happened a few days later. I was in a camp called Mia Mia, and I was surrounded by a group of militants. And they asked me where I was from. I said the United States. They went to town on President Bush and the Bush administration. I said, have you ever met an American before? They said no. I said, well, have you ever met a Jewish American before? They said no. I said, well, what would you do if a Jewish American came into your camp? One of them spoke up very resolutely and said, oh, well, we would cut his head off. And so I talked to them about music and kind of what they like doing for fun. I was desperate to change the subject. And so I did. We talked for about an hour, and suddenly their frustration shifted from being anti-American and anti-Israeli towards the corruption of the local politicians, the fact that they don't have pens in the classroom, the fact that there's no jobs for them and no opportunity for them in the particular area where they were living. And after about an hour of talking, I asked them, well, would it surprise you if I told you that I was Jewish? And they sort of looked at me blankly. And again, this was one of these moments where I didn't know if it was 5 seconds or 5 minutes. And this time a much quieter and female voice actually spoke up from the other side of the group and said, oh, we knew you were Jewish the whole time. We were just kidding with you. Now, I don't know if that was true or not. But again, it was one of these moments where the perception and the reality of what I was actually interacting with was this kind of interesting dichotomy between young people and the violent extremism that they espouse. And so I basically spent months and months interviewing a lot of these militants. And remember, I told you when I first talked to them, I would ask them why they joined these groups, and they'd give me the very expected answer. So what I started doing is asking them to tell me what year and date they were born. What was their earliest memory? How old were they when they started school? Essentially retracing their entire socialization process up until the point where something happened. They got bad grades and got kicked out of school. Their brother was killed in battle. Their girlfriend dumped them, which is one I heard about 2 or 3 times. They got into a fight. They had an affair. They had premarital sex and somebody got pregnant. Very, very actual normal grievances that anyone around the world could imagine encountering. And I asked them, well, who was your support network? I couldn't go home because my parents would have shamed me. I was scared of honor killing. I came from a broken home. I didn't have anybody to turn to. I was scared of my parents. I didn't have any friends. Well, so who helped you? Well, I played football with these 3 guys who started taking me to this mosque. And I was never really that religious before this. Or, instead of going to the mosque that my parents went to because I didn't want them to tell my parents, there was this other mosque that was twice as far from my home, and I started going there. Or someone handed me a leaflet in the streets while I was crying. And you realize how much chance played into this. And I'd ask them, well, so then what happened? And you realize that during a moment where they experience a grievance that anyone in this audience could imagine possibly encountering or feeling themselves, they felt alienated. And the individual who they met by chance, who helped them overcome that alienation by providing them with an identity or a group to belong to, became the avenue through which they found violent extremism. And I realized these young people aren't so much gun-toting mass militants shouting Allahu Akbar, but they're more broken souls with dangerous toys who would rather have a pen in their hand, but ultimately it depends on who gets to them first. And so I became completely fascinated with this idea that radicalization is less of a religious ideology, or less of a religious or an ideological issue, and much more of a youth issue. And we don't look at it as a youth issue. Everyone's out there trying to counter narratives, promote moderate forms of a religion, engaging in religious debates that nobody's ever going to win. And nobody's looking at the problem at its core, which is these young people do not have alternatives that will potentially divert them away from recruitment. So then, just by chance, I was in Colombia. Now, this is another interesting one. I like this one because the girls that actually walked by them, the guys actually said something to them, and they just kind of laughed it off. But I was in Colombia by chance for completely different work for Secretary Rice. And I was there about a month after 12 million people protested in the streets in 190 cities against a 40-plus-year-old terrorist organization called the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. The 2 weeks that followed those demonstrations saw the largest number of demobilizations and desertions from the FARC in its 40-plus-year history. I had the chance to go by helicopter out to a region called La Macarena to visit a community that had just been taken back from the FARC 5 days before I got there. It had been under FARC control for over 32 years, just returned to the government of Colombia. So I had the chance to talk to several demobilized FARC who had literally just demobilized a few days before I got there. Some of them, in particular, this gentleman in the blue shirt, had been in the FARC for over 15 years. And so I sat there and I listened to their stories and asked them why they joined, and I swear, had I not seen what they looked like, heard their accent, or known that I was in Colombia, I would have been hearing the exact same things that I heard in the Middle East. I would have sworn that I was talking to people in the Middle East. Their stories matched in a way that completely shocked me. And then I started thinking to myself, maybe this idea of radicalization being a youth issue is even bigger than I thought. I wonder, do people join gangs for the same reason that they join violent Islamist extremist groups and the same reasons that they join terrorist groups like the FARC? And so I came back to Washington really excited about this. And I asked Secretary Rice to please let me go down to Central America. And I believe her response was, I really had no background in Central America. She knew me more as somebody with a background on Iran and the Middle East and terrorism. But she let me go because I had this hypothesis that if I went and talked to gang members in places like Guatemala, groups like 18th Street, Mara Salvatrucha, and others, that I may hear something similar to what I heard in the Middle East and what I heard in Colombia. So I did that, and I talked to dozens of current and former gang members. And again, I was shocked, this time less so than in Colombia, by how similarly their stories matched. And so over time, this idea began to build up. And it really wasn't something that I could do much with in government. Because in government, again, you're limited in who you can reach out to. There's political sensitivities around these issues. There's certain just obstacles that prevent you from getting truly creative and building things around this idea. So when I went to Google, I decided that one of the first things I wanted to do to get people to think about and act on radicalization in different ways is, why not look at all the different former gang members, former religious extremists, former right-wing extremists, and former nationalist extremists. There's a lot of formers out there, former defined by people that were part of these groups, left, and are now actively and publicly working against them in full view of local government and law enforcement, who are the most credible voices against these violent extremist organizations. Nobody knows who they are. They're few and far between. They're disconnected. Any one of them on their own is so easy to discredit. They're very charismatic figures, and they're credible, which is the most important part. So one of the things that we're going to do June 26th to 28th in partnership with the Council on Foreign Relations, and actually in association with Tribeca Film Festival International, is we're actually going to convene about 80 former religious extremists, former nationalist extremists, former right-wing extremists, and former gang members in Dublin for 2 days in what we describe as a big intellectual collision to get us to think about and act on this challenge in new and innovative ways. With the idea of building a counter-movement to groups like Al-Qaeda, to all the different gangs, to groups like the FARC, to a counter-movement to the white supremacist movement that can have as its face these credible voices who used to be part of it and have now left. Imagine you get all these people together. You have former gang members from Haiti interacting with former members of the Bloods and Crips, interacting with former Ansari Hezbollah, interacting with former Jamaat Islamiyah, former Jamaat Islamiyah who trained to be, who had trained in militant activities, interacting with former neo-Nazis and former skinheads. Just imagine all of this coming together, and then throw in some former FARC, some former ELN, some former Hizb ut-Tahrir, and nobody knows what could actually happen because those groups of people have never actually been brought together. Now, I've been doing this in the lead up to Dublin on a smaller scale, bringing together 6 different formers, bringing together 12 different formers. And what's amazing is you bring any number of them in a room together. They've never met formers from these other contexts, only from their own context. And it's only when they start talking to each other that they begin to realize how many similarities there are. And it's only when you realize the common denominators across all these groups that you actually realize that maybe we've all been solving for the wrong problem. That it's less of a battle of ideas, it's less about ideologies, and it's more how do we overwhelm these at-risk youth with substantive alternatives that can distract them off the path of recruitment. And the former gang member can teach the former Islamist can teach the former FARC can teach the former neo-Nazi. These stories are so compelling. And then we're also inviting about 20 survivors of terrorism and survivors of violence perpetrated by all these different groups. Now, what's interesting about what we're trying to do here is you wouldn't necessarily expect a company like Google to be doing this. Our mission statement is to organize the world's information, make it available, make it useful, do no evil in the process of trying to make the world a better place. Well, we all know radicalization is a challenge to the world being safe. And we believe that actually by bringing all these different perspectives together that haven't actually been convened and connected, we actually are organizing the world's information. We believe that finding tangible outcomes that can result from bringing them together and fostering this kind of intellectual collision, that we can actually make that information useful. And we believe that by taking what comes out of this summit and all the conversations and putting it online, we can make it available so that everybody from NGOs to academics to technology companies to just concerned citizens who actually care about this can actually do something productive with it. So, what are my takeaways from this? Scott asked me to leave you with a bunch of takeaways. And some of these may seem simple and obvious, but nonetheless, this is how I kind of break this down. The first is I think you have to be unbelievably excited about everything, an idea that you're working on. If you're not the most enthusiastic person around your idea, then it's going to be really difficult for other people to rally around it. There's nothing more powerful than when somebody walks into your office and is just oozing with enthusiasm and passion, because that's contagious. And oftentimes, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to about this idea that I described to you today who say, I have absolutely no idea what my role is, but I have to help. And I'm so passionate about this that I feel like I can walk into somebody's office and say to them, I have no idea how you can be helpful or what your role is, but I need you on board. And they'll jump on board. Second is people have to feel invested in this. So one of the things we've been adamant about from the beginning is Google, in partnership with CFR and TFFI, are convening and connecting this. We're the facilitators of this. But ultimately, this is going to be successful only by involving the formers and the survivors who we're inviting in the content itself. So this network that we've already built of former extremists and survivors of extremism, they've been involved in everything from shaping the agenda to shaping the content. And I can't tell you how many mistakes we would have made had we not actually done that. Some of the simplest things that just aren't obvious to us because we don't live this day in and day out. And so having them be part of this, they feel very invested in making sure this is successful. But it also builds a community around an idea. Third, I really believe in being intellectually adventurous. I think that it's so easy to pursue ideas with obvious conclusions. When I was in college, I used to do this all the time. It's one of the reasons I decided not to be an anthropologist. We have absolutely no idea what's going to happen in Dublin. We don't know what we're going to learn from it. We don't know if there's going to be a gigantic new network formed, a network of networks, or perhaps the hypothesis that we believe to be true is in fact not true. But we're willing to take that risk because it's interesting and it's important and it's something new around this huge challenge. Finally, controversy is important. I'm a strong believer in the fact that if you're not creating waves, then you're not pushing enough. If you're creating too many waves, you're probably unnecessarily pissing people off. Second to last, I think it's okay to be wrong. As I said earlier, misperceptions are an incredibly important driver of coming up with an idea. And then lastly, I think when people tell you something's a crazy idea, that won't work, that's impossible, It should just make you get out of bed 2 hours earlier and pursue that idea even further. Thanks.